Hello, everybody. Happy President's Day. Also, end of Valentine's Day weekend. And welcome to our last audiobook stream, at least for a while. We finally will finish this book that we started. Was it November? Oh, heaven only knows. And I hope everybody is doing well today. Yes, we're streaming a reasonable hour. Hey, Stock, how are you today? Which is good, because I have work tomorrow. And I probably should be doing more work on my day off. Nah. Maybe. And thank you to everybody who came out to my last couple of streams on... What did we do last night? It was ages ago. Oh, right. Last night was the Valentine's Day special, and we played more of Hotoful Boyfriend. And on Saturday, we played Morph Girl, a short horror FMV. And on Wednesday, we finished D, a particularly strange and violent FMV from the 90s. And tonight, we're going to finally finish Welsh Rarebit Tales. Then maybe I'll give it to my father for his birthday. I do like this cover, though. Like this book has illustrations, even if the stories are kind of hit or miss. There've been a couple that I really liked, but yeah. I think Stories in the Dark, which we read before this, had a higher number of stories that I really liked. And as a reminder, since it's an audiobook stream, raids are disabled and alerts are disabled, and I won't have TTS on, and I won't be responding to chat until the end of the stream. Yes, so I can keep the flow of the reading going, and because eventually I'm going to edit these streams into actual audiobooks and put them up on LibriVox or something. I say I'm going to do that. But I also say I'm going to do my taxes before the last minute. And sell a screenplay. Ooh, and make dinner tonight. And who knows what I'll do and what I won't do. Do I need help? Professional help? Probably. Help with my taxes? Also probably. Help selling a screenplay? Yeah. Any agents or managers in chat? Help making dinner? I think I can manage. Oh, to convert it to audiobook. I don't think so, Stock. I appreciate it, but I think I should be able to just extract audio from the VODs on YouTube and then edit it together in Sony SoundForge. Or perhaps, more to the point, in Audacity. It's amazing how easy Audacity is to use. For free, no less. Let's see. We'd gone through 10 stories. Ah, here we are. A study in psychology. In one corner of his solitary cell, with face buried in his hands, sat Jean Lescaut, wife poisoner, waiting for the morrow on which he would be I'm just going to start over. A study in psychology. In the corner of his solitary cell, with face buried in his hands, sat Jean Lescaut, wife poisoner, waiting for the morrow on which he would expiate his crimes. Each hour, as the sentry made his rounds, he saw the prisoner sitting in that same hopeless attitude of despair. A month before, when he first heard his sentence, he had raved and fought impotently. Night after night and day after day he had paced his narrow cell like a caged animal, but now that was over. Already the shadow of the doom which was so near had fallen upon him. Presently there was a sound of footsteps, and the prisoner heard two people in conversation coming down the corridor. But he did not stir. Events of that day had no interest for him. He was to be electrocuted on the morrow. The steps stopped outside his cell, and he heard the attendant saying, "I am sorry, Dr. Van Horn, but I can give you only an hour. Orders are orders, you know." The heavy barred door swung open, was closed and locked again, and the turnkey walked away. Jean Lescaut looked up wearily and without curiosity. He saw a tall clerical gentleman regarding him intently. "Jean Lescaut," began the stranger, stepping close to the prisoner, "I have come here today to offer you the only thing on earth which you care for, liberty." A quick flush of color dyed the prison pallor of the man in irons, then as quickly faded again. "I am going to offer this to you," the doctor continued, "not because I think you innocent of the crime of which you were convicted, not because I have any friendship for you, or because I desire to defeat justice. The proposition I make you is purely in the interest of science. Have you ever been hypnotized?" The prisoner shook his head. "Have you ever seen anyone in such a condition?" Lescaut nodded wearily. All this talk irritated him. He wished that the man would stop looking at him so intently and questioning him so much. It reminded him of that other day in the courtroom, when the lawyer for the prosecution had looked at him in just such a way, and had asked him so many questions that he had become confused and told many things that he had never intended to tell. "If you have seen it done, so much the better. You have probably seen persons put under this influence and then undergo tests which you know would be a physical impossibility for them to endure otherwise. I have myself given subjects arsenic, telling them it was sugar, and they felt no bad effects. I have also burned with hot irons and thrust pins into the flesh of such persons without their feeling any pain. Now what I have to propose to you, Jean Lescaut, is this. Tomorrow at noon you are to go to the electric chair, where 1800 volts of electricity will be sent through your body. At 11 o'clock tomorrow I will come to your cell and put you in an hypnotic sleep. You will go to the chair, show all the symptoms and effects of a person electrocuted, and you will apparently be dead. In reality, however, you will only be asleep, and, as I can easily obtain your body from the prison doctor on the pretense of using it for dissection purposes, I can then awaken you." The prisoner leaned over and clutched the doctor's arm so tightly that he winced. "And what then?" he whispered eagerly. "Then, as I have just said, I will awaken you. I will have proven that a certain theory of mine is correct or false, and you will have obtained your liberty, for I shall not hinder you from going where you will after the experiment is over. But I must first try and see if I can get control of you. You may not be susceptible to any influence." An hour later, the turnkey came to inform Van Horn that his hour had expired, and the preliminary trial must have been a success, for there was a smile of triumph on the doctor's face as he bade the prisoner good day. Next day, an hour previous to the time set for the electrocution of Jean Lescaut, Dr. Van Horn again visited the prisoner in his cell. At 12 o'clock 2 attendants came and conducted him to the fatal room. The reporters and prison officials present remarked on the calmness of the doomed man. He walked to the chair without assistance, and submitted to the strapping down and adjusting of the sponges and electrodes without a tremor. When all was ready, the warden stepped to the side of the chair. "Jean Lescaut," said he, "I am about to give the signal for you to be sent into eternity. Have you anything to say?" The man in the chair shook his head. The warden stepped back out of sight and made a sign to an attendant behind the screen. A switch was thrown on, and the voltimeter registered nearly 2,000 volts of electricity were passing through the hooded figure in the chair. The warden held his watch in his hand, glancing first at it, then at Lescaut. At the end of 8 seconds he made another sign, and the man at the switch cut off the current. The prison doctor stepped up from one side and examined the body carefully. "Justice is satisfied. I pronounce Jean Lescaut dead," he said solemnly, and motioning to 2 of the attendants, he made them carry away the body. That night, in a dissecting room in the suburbs of Albany, a crowd of scientific men assembled at the invitation of Dr. Van Horn to witness an important experiment. No one knew what that experiment was to be, but everyone had accepted the invitation, for Van Horn had a high reputation among his colleagues. When the last expected guest had arrived, the doctor made a few remarks to the company. "I have invited you here tonight," he said, "to witness an experiment which, if I am not mistaken, I have the distinction of being the first to attempt. I have today taken the law in my own hands, but, if the theory on which I have been working is correct, justice will not be deprived of its victim. Today, 1 hour previous to his electrocution, I hypnotized Jean Lescaut, the man who poisoned his wife, strangled his child, and who was sentenced to death last July. While under my influence, I told him that the current of electricity which would be sent through his body would not kill him, but would only put him to sleep, from which tonight I would awaken him. After he was pronounced dead by the prison doctor, I secured his body for dissection, and have had it brought into the next room. Now, if a theory on which I have been working for the last year is correct, the impression which I left on his brain has kept that electricity from producing death, and at my command, Jean Lescaut, though to all appearances a corpse, will speak to us tonight." There was an air of expectation among the doctors present as Van Horn stepped into the adjoining room. Presently he returned, wheeling a light operating chair, over which a sheet was thrown. "If everything should not happen in accordance with my theory, of course what happens tonight is under the seal of the profession," he observed quietly, as he lifted the cloth. "I wish you all to examine this body, and state whether or not the man is dead." The doctors crowded around the figure in the chair, and used every known means to detect the presence of life in the body. At the end of 10 minutes, everyone declared that Jean Lescaut was dead, that it was impossible to discover a sign of life. Dr. Van Horn pushed the operating chair with its strange burden directly under the electric light, turning the reflector so that the strong rays fell full on the pallid upturned face. He passed his hand lightly and rapidly over the man's temples. "Jean Lescaut," he said slowly, "can you hear me?" There was no sign of life on the part of the sleeper, and Van Horn repeated his question, speaking more sharply. Then, hardened though they were by numberless horrible scenes at the operating table, many of the doctors shuddered, for, slowly, indeed so slowly that the motion was barely perceptible, the figure in the chair began to nod its head. "Answer me!" cried Van Horn, raising his voice and taking both of the man's hands in his own. One of the doctors, younger than the others, raised the window and thrust his head out into the cold air. The room was becoming oppressive. Slowly, Jean Lescaut's mouth opened. The lips parted, but now no sound came forth. "Speak!" cried Van Horn sternly. "I have been executed. I cannot speak. I am dead." The words came from the man in jerky, spasmodic sentences, as if torn from him against his will. "Tell me, I command you, what happened since I left you this morning?" "I am dead," repeated the murderer in a dull, mechanical tone. Dr. Van Horn stepped once more on to the chair. He held one hand firmly against the man's forehead. The other he reached down behind the head and pressed at the base of the brain. Again the man began to speak, this time more rapidly than before, but in a harsh, crackling voice. They came and took me from my cell and put me in a chair. They strapped me down and put sponges on my spine and on my ankles. Then they put 10,000 needles into my body, and I began to grow cold and numb. My heart stopped beating, and I could not breathe, and now I am dead. But you are breathing. And now I am dead, repeated the other mechanically. Dr. Van Horn loosened his hands from the man and turned to the watching group. So far I have succeeded, said he. So far my theory is correct. The electricity did not produce death in this man because his brain could not receive the sensation. Now I am going to bring him out of the hypnotic state and see if my theory is entirely correct. He did not state what that theory was, but stepped back to the man in the chair and began speaking in a low tone. He took both eyelids and, rolling them up, looked straight into the sleeper's eyes. John Lescaut, he said sharply, come to yourself. You are no longer asleep. For the first time the man moved his body slightly, as if trying to rise. Slowly a bright red spot began to appear on each pallid cheek. His eyes rolled down from under the lids, and the pupils began to dilate. Then, suddenly, an awful horror came into his face, and without a word of warning, as if impelled by some unseen force, he leapt forward and fell writhing and twisting on the floor over 8 feet away. His arms and legs beat the air and floor for a minute convulsively, then stiffened into strange, grotesque positions. Dr. Van Horn knelt down beside the body and examined it carefully. Then he stood up and smiled, though he was very pale. Gentlemen, he said, I was entirely correct in my theory. Had I not expected this ending, I would never have dared to thus violate the law and bring this man back to life. That deadly charge of electricity, which was held back from acting by the influence of my hypnotism, has at last accomplished its work, as you yourselves just saw. When the numbness produced by hypnotic sleep left the man's brain, nature began to act, and the shock to the nervous system was all the more powerful because the electricity had changed its form to a static charge. You need not fear. This time he is really dead. And thus Jean Lescaut, wife poisoner and perpetrator of a dozen crimes, helped in his expiation of those crimes to advance the cause of science, and justice was not cheated, for the execution of his sentence was merely postponed the matter of a few hours. The Painted Lady and the Boy. Bud Phillips says the boy is going to the devil, announced Stebbins, as he strolled into the smoking room at the Sherwood Club after beating Perkins 3 games of billiards. Well, Bud is certainly in a position to be accurately informed on that subject, answered the colonel, and the truth of his reply was so apparent that everyone smiled. Bud was night clerk at the Algonquin, the hotel where the boy had a suite, so he had a chance to see at what hour and how the guests came home. He also knew just how many times a week the boy's rooms were a rendezvous for the young subalterns from Fort Blair, who came into town every time they could get leave to gamble away their month's scanty pay. But as Bud Phillips had said, the boy wasn't entirely to blame, for he had never had a mother's care, and though no one in Preston City except the colonel and I knew the facts of his early life, everyone had a good word for him, and was inclined to overlook many indiscretions on the part of popular Billy Richards, the boy. Colonel Wade and I could remember the day when Stuart Sloane shocked the good people back in Sioux City by bringing home for wife La Petite Mabelle, skirt dancer from a vaudeville theater in Des Moines. The predictions of the sewing club gossips were more than fulfilled, for La Petite Mabel ran away one fine day before the year was up, leaving Sloane with a 2-month-old baby boy, and a little note of farewell. La Petite Mabel told him in melodramatic sentences, covering 2 sheets of notepaper, that the attractions of the old life, with its cheap finery and grease paint, were too strong for her. She could never remain in Sioux City, where nobody called on her. Stuart himself seemed ashamed of her, and where there was nothing going on. She said, further, that he mustn't think too badly of her, and that he ought to try and forget her. This Sloane had certainly tried hard enough to do. That fall he secured a divorce, and when the legislature convened in Des Moines next year, he had the name that La Petite Mabel had disgraced changed to Richards, his mother's maiden name. So young William Richards, as Sloane rechristened the boy, grew up to manhood, never knowing the tragedy of his father's early life, and never having felt the softening influence of a mother's love. His father died when the lad was 12, naming as his son's guardian Colonel Wade, who looked after him as well as an old bachelor of 50, loaded down with business cares, could be expected to look after a growing and spirited youth. When Billy attained his majority and had finished his college days, bluff old Colonel Wade took him aside as gently as a warm-hearted old man could do, told him the story of his first appearance on the stage of life, turned over to him a property more than sufficient for every reasonable need, and sent him out in the world, which still called him the boy, a nickname he had acquired in college. The boy pondered over his early history for a few days, and then apparently forgot that any such unpleasant thing as history existed, concerning himself wholly with the present, which may be history, though at the time not recognized as such. Lately, the boy had been drinking and doing some other things more than was good for him, but when the colonel remonstrated in a fatherly way, he promised to take a brace, the same as he would have promised back in his college days, when he was under the discipline of the old professors. Stevens's remark, therefore, that the boy was going to the devil, was rather a surprise to me, for I knew that he usually kept his word. "Did any of you see the fairy that came in on the express this afternoon?" asked Perkins a little later, and, as no one answered, he proceeded to explain. "I went down to the 3 o'clock to meet Kitty, who came in from Denver today, and the first person who stepped off the train was the looking female you ever saw. She must have been 45, but she had locks as golden as a maid of 15, and actually, I believe there was half a box of rouge on her cheeks. She had a little woolly dog in her arms, so covered with ribbons that I don't believe it could walk alone. Kitty said she was flirting with the conductor all the way down from Butte, and someone on the train christened her the Painted Lady." "Where's she stopping?" asked the colonel, and I knew what was in his mind. "She rode uptown on the same bus with Kitty and me, and got out at the Algonquin," answered Perkins. "You'd better look out for that protege of yours, Colonel. He may be doing something rash." The boy appeared to be partial to blondes. The next day, as I was coming downtown, I nearly upset a woman hurrying in the opposite direction. I picked up the parasol which I had knocked out of her hand, and as I glanced at her, I knew from Perkins's description that she was the Painted Lady. She probably wasn't more than 37 or 38, but there were deep lines about her eyes and the corners of her mouth, which ought not to be on the face of a woman of 60. Her hair, under the stimulating influence of peroxide, was a bright yellow, and her cheeks had on them the bloom usually found on buxom Irish lasses, or in small round boxes in a drugstore. At the end of a silver chain, and covered with ribbons, was a diminutive French poodle. She was stylishly dressed, and her figure, though making me wonder at the time and strength taken to produce it, was still quite pleasing to look at in the final result. Her name, as I found out at the club that evening, was Madame Mabel Fortescue, and one of the evening papers stated that she was a young widow taking a western trip for her health. She had a suite at the Algonquin, and spent most of her time driving about the city, for she had sent to Denver for a showy turnout, and it was not long before it became a common sight to see her riding about with some one of the young officers of Fort Blair beside her. Dame Rumor, never inclined to be delicate in her handling of young widows who travel about the country without chaperones, of course had a fling at Madame Fortescue, and if only half the stories which were circulated about her were true, she must have found Preston City a lively place. The day of her arrival, the boy had been called away to Chicago on business, so the colonel and I were relieved of any immediate worry as to an acquaintance being established between him and the Painted Lady, as nearly everyone in Preston City quickly came to call the widow. The boy came back 2 weeks later, however, and our worst fears were then realized, for he immediately became as attentive to Madame Fortescue as any of the young subalterns from the fort. Most of the men at the club talked it over good-naturedly, and, man-fashion, considered it a good joke, but the wives of these same club men regarded it differently. It was even rumored that old Mrs. Burton, the worst gossip in the city, had written to a girl in Boston to whom the boy was engaged. "If she were only some young thing and good-looking," groaned the colonel, "it wouldn't be so bad. But what he can find in that fudged-up old woman is more than I can see. Why, man, she is old enough to be his mother." He intended to speak to the boy about it, but never did, for he knew he could not talk to the young man when there was a woman in the case, the same as he could when it was merely a question of gambling or drinking too much. Things were going on badly enough, when one evening, as I was seated in the reading room at the Sherwood, looking over a paper, I heard Stebbins talking to a group in the next room. "Yes, I've found out the whole history of the Painted Lady," he was saying. "She's all that old Lady Burton says and more. She's been living down at the Rapids for a year or two, and I saw Jack Denvers when I was down there last week, and he gave me the whole story. She was a skirt dancer, among other things, when she was young, and someway got her hooks onto a young fellow from Sioux City named Sloane. He came from a fine family, and his people were all broken up over the affair, for she proved a bad lot, I reckon. She ran away from him before they had been married a year, and has been going down the line ever since. Denvers says that if she stops up here, the married women would better watch out. She's the woman that was mixed up in the Stanley divorce case down at the Rapids last year, and they say she got... Hello, what's the matter with Billy? Same old story?" Alarmed, for I had not the slightest idea that the boy was there, I turned and saw him staggering blindly from the room. He ran against a hat-tree, and some of the men laughed, but I saw his face, and I knew that it was not the drink that made him look so ghastly. I hurried up to the card-room where the colonel was playing his evening game of whist, and whispered a word in his ear. I got him into an alcove, and told him what had just taken place. "Good God, this is horrible," he muttered. "Why, it's his own mother, and he knows it." We hastened from the club, but there were no carriages in sight outside. "The boy just staggered out bareheaded, and drove off towards his hotel in the only cab here," said Perkins, who was coming up the steps. "What's the matter with him? I spoke to him, but he didn't answer." "Slewed again?" We did not stop to satisfy his curiosity, but walked rapidly up to the Algonquin. "He went upstairs about 10 minutes ago," the clerk told us in answer to our question, and grinned knowingly. The door of his room was not locked, and after knocking several times without getting any reply, we went in and found just what I had feared we should find. The boy, lying face downwards on the floor, one hand clasping a discharged revolver. I looked at the powder-stained cheek, and though I felt that it was absolutely hopeless, I left the colonel kneeling by his side and hurried out in search of a doctor. As I stood by the front door, hesitating which way to go, a trap was driven up under the electric lights, and a beardless youth in lieutenant's uniform helped a loudly dressed woman to alight. They walked through the foyer and entered the elevator, laughing and talking, while a little yellow dog, covered with ribbons, capered and barked in front of them. It was the Painted Lady and another boy. The Palace of Sin. The following advertisement, even had it never appeared in any of the great dailies, would probably have occasioned little comment or curiosity. Those who are weary of the laws and so-called society restrictions of the present day can find an immediate and complete relief by applying at once to Jennifer Vass, Lock Box 3265B. Even in 1885, though the business had not then attained the gigantic proportions of the present day, the advertising genius was still at work, and anyone chancing to read such a notice would no doubt have set it down as the bait thrown out by the vendor of some patent medicine, weight lift, or equally undesirable article. The promoters of the scheme for the pursuance of vice, as they facetiously called it among themselves, realized this, and did not attempt to reach the public by any such open means. To make known their project, they resorted to other methods which, though acting quietly and unnoticed, nevertheless produced sufficient effect, so that on the night of June 16th, 1885, when the floating palace of iniquity, Lawless, left one of the North River piers, she had on board 800 souls. That is to say, there were 800 passengers, but, judging from the declared object with which the Lawless put to sea, it is more probable that the souls of those on board had been left behind. This voyage of the Lawless was the result of much thought on the part of 3 individuals who, at one time or another, had figured prominently in the police courts of New York and Chicago. Jennifer Vass, in whose brain the plan had first found its inception, was at one time proprietor of the Red Inn, a feeble imitation of the Moulin Rouge of Paris, while Jackson Elbers and Louis Hoopman had both been mixed up in various enterprises, all of which tended to cater to the animal rather than the intellectual passions of their patrons. 3 miles from land, as, you may not happen to know, is the limit of distance to which the law of the neighboring country applies. When beyond that point, on the high seas, no law on earth is valid, save the orders of the ship's captain. Knowing this fact, and from the knowledge of human nature gained in their various former pursuits, the 3 men mentioned had gotten together a few $1,000s and purchased the Atlanta, once an ocean liner of the White Star Line. The Atlanta had been taken from the passenger service, being unable to compete with her faster rivals on the Cunard and Hamburg-Bremen lines, and it was planned to remodel and use her for a freight steamer. Hearing of this, and as speed was no object in the excursions which the Palace of Sin was to make, Jennifer Vass and his 2 companions made an offer which was immediately accepted by the managers of the White Star Line. Then a work of transformation began. According to the scheme of Jennifer Vass, every vice which tempts men and women, every form of iniquity of the old and the new world, was to be introduced, cultivated, and pampered on board the Lawless. 10 staterooms were torn to pieces and made into one. The floors were covered with Turkish rugs. Baghdad curtains and Eastern ornaments were hung about the walls. The final appearance of the room was totally different from the little holes in the wall found in the Chinatown of nearly all the large cities, but its object was the same. Here men and women could smoke opium from morning till night, and with the additional advantage that no one would disturb them. There was no danger of the place being raided, and their names appearing in the next morning's police court items. On one of the walls was arranged a set of bunks on which the sleepers could be laid away when the drug was really on. One half the ship was converted into a gambling hall. Here every game of chance at Monte Carlo, faro, roulette, poker, piquet, fantan, and every other game by which a man can win a fortune or lose his all in a single night, was to be put into operation. There was to be a bar where every known strong drink could be bought, and each man was to be the judge of when he had had enough. No waiter could inform him that the management refused to serve him anything more, and he would have to go elsewhere. Here one could swill brandy, absinthe, bhang, or any other nerve-destroying drink until his brain reeled, and as long as he had the money to pay for more, no one would stop him. Every drug and narcotic whose sale is guarded by the laws of the United States and other civilized countries was to be sold as freely as the chocolates of the confectioner. Cocaine, opium, laudanum, and morphine were laid in bulk for the use of the passengers of the Lawless, without limit or restriction. In fact, there was wine for the drinker, women for him who wanted company, song for him who would sing, and each and every other evil thing ever devised by a wicked and lustful world was to be found somewhere between the two decks of this palace of sin. The trips were to last 1 month, the Lawless merely getting into mid-ocean and steaming slowly down the Gulf of Mexico, remaining there until the month was up, when the passengers, saturated by vice and steeped in corruption, were to be returned to the place of starting. The crew was cut down to as small a number as possible, and consisted mostly of the riffraff to be found about the wharves of any large seaport city. There was nothing about the scheme which could be punished by the laws of any country. Nevertheless, the arrangements were kept as quiet as possible, and nothing found its way into the papers. On the night of June 16th, 1885, the Lawless, as the boat was very appropriately rechristened, steamed away from New York. The passengers had begun to arrive in the evening as soon as it became dark, and at 12:30 every one who had engaged passage was on board. There was no one down on the pier to speed the departing voyage, or to wish him good luck. The sinister expedition set out without as much as the wave of a handkerchief from shore. She was a little longer in getting under way than had been anticipated, but at 2 o'clock in the morning of the 17th, the Lawless was well out to sea, and the great hull, which was up till then, save for a few lights about deck, had been kept quite dark, suddenly burst into light. Down in the hold, a big Westinghouse generator was whirling away, and, at a word from the captain, 1,500 electric lights were suddenly switched into circuit, and the Lawless was on full blast. The limit was reached, and the ship had come to her own. There was one flaw, however, in the scheme of the Palace of Sin. That flaw was Pierre Planchet, first assistant engineer. Like most of the lower officers, he had been hired without knowing the object of the voyage, thinking that the Lawless was merely bound on a pleasure cruise in southern waters. He had just come from the Bellevue Hospital, where he had been dangerously sick with brain fever, and he was still far from recovered, but hearing of the position and the high pay that went with it, he had left the hospital against the orders of the house physician. The man who had been originally hired for assistant having disappointed Jennifer Vass, the patient, with traces of the fever still upon him, was engaged on the very day of departure. When, therefore, the 3-mile limit was passed, and the hell up on deck broke out, Pierre Planchet turned to his chief for explanation of the sound of revelry floating down below decks. "You don't mean to say you don't know the object of this ship?" asked the chief. "Why, the Lawless is a floating hell. For the next 30 days, every form of vice known to the civilized world will be going on up there. There's 500 men and 300 women in this gilded shell whose only object in life for 1 month will be to commit acts which on the shore would be punished by the laws, by fines and imprisonment." Without a word, the assistant left the chief engineer, and, seeking out the captain, demanded to be put on shore. "You've signed with us for 1 month, and by G***, you'll have to stay," was all the answer he could get from Jennifer Vass, to whom the captain sent him. Then a strange thing happened. Into the disordered brain of the man, a short time before, racked by fever, there came the thought that he had been chosen by God to be the instrument to punish the iniquity which had come to his knowledge. He returned to the captain and demanded a raise of $15 a month in his pay, claiming he did not know the kind of a job he was undertaking when he had signed. Oh, he was cunning, this fever-stricken assistant engineer. He knew how to allay suspicion. The raise of pay was granted, for Jennifer Vass did not like the look in the man's eyes. Planchet went about his work, however, for the next few days, quietly and apparently satisfied. And when by chance his duties took him up to where the painted women sang and gamed, and the drunken men made ribald jests, he only smiled strangely to himself and went on with his work. But he was busy all this time doing many things for which an assistant engineer is not usually paid to perform. One evening he came to Vass, the man who was really in command of the Lawless, and asked to be shown about the ship. It was a strange request for an under-officer to make to the owner of a ship, but Vass, as usual somewhat in his cups, and feeling particularly good-natured, for the money was coming in faster than he had dared to hope, consented. Together they went into the gaming-room, and the young engineer saw crowds of men and women standing about with whirling wheels, or sitting about the tables with the light of greed in their eyes. Here the women laughed shrilly as the croupier pushed toward her a pile of money, while beside her a man cursed his luck in language which would have shamed a demon. They went to the opium den, and saw the men and women, some safely tucked away on the little shelves, others sitting on low divans, while half a dozen grinning Chinamen cooked the little brown beads and brought to them. They went into other rooms, seeing sights which I will not describe, and everywhere suggestive songs and oaths met their ears. That night, about 12 o'clock, a man slipped about the decks of the Lawless, making little noises but working busily. He went to the ship's boats and removed from all save the one in the stern small sections of the bottom, which had been cunningly sawed out. He went down in the hold to each of the pumps, and smiled to himself as he noted the cylinders from which the plungers had been removed. Then he drew a few more cans of oil and carried them down to where the coal was stored, and when he returned the cans were empty. From there he went to his cabin and carried a few more things to the one boat in the stern which had not been tampered with. Then, although everything was completed, he paused irresolutely. He went to some of the rooms into which Jennifer Vass had taken him earlier in that evening. He did not go into them, but stood and listened to the sounds which came out through transoms and half-open doors, and as he listened, the former look of determination began to come back to his face. He paused for a minute outside the drinking-room, listening to the chorus of a vulgar song. The door opened, and a couple of men staggering out started for the part of the ship given over to the women. As they marched past him, Planchet heard a remark one of them made to the other. He turned and walked swiftly to the hold, and, lighting a match, held it over the spot on the coal where nearly a barrel of oil had been soaked in. Then he stole back to the upper deck, slipped the ship's boat carefully over the side, and dropped into the sea. He remained perfectly motionless, watching the great form of the Lawless as she steamed slowly past him. Taking up his oars, he pulled along for a little way, and the distance between him and the ship did not increase greatly, for, as had been observed, speed of travelling was not one of the pleasures provided to the passengers of the Lawless. In a little while he saw a number of lights flash out on deck, and the black forms of many men hurrying to and fro were silhouetted against the sky. Then, suddenly, above the roar of the water, he heard the piercing shriek of a woman. He shivered slightly and ceased rowing. The ship's engines had stopped, and the boat was rolling heavily on the swell. Great clouds of black smoke began to pour from the hatchways, and across the water he heard the sound of men trying to get out the boats. An undertaking followed immediately by an angry cursing, in which he heard his own name mingled. But he only smiled again, that same strange smile that had been on his face for the last week, when, as he worked down in the bowels of the ship, he heard the sounds of riot above. "He'll be after the pumps now," muttered the instrument of God to himself, and he laughed mirthlessly. He took up his oars and began rowing again. He knew it was many miles to the nearest land, but he must get away from that great flaming eye which seemed to be winking at him. The cries and shrieks of despair from those on board the burning ship were awful to hear, so he sang loudly and drowned out the noise. He rowed furiously till nearly daybreak, when, sinking to the bottom of the boat, he slept from sheer exhaustion. When he opened his eyes again, the sun was high in the heavens. He looked around him for some trace of his last night's work, but only the great green expanse of water met his eye. There was not a speck on the waters. Of the 800 passengers who had set out a week before in pursuit of sin, not one remained. 5 days later, the Boris, a merchantman plying between Savannah and New York, picked up a man off Hatteras, drifting about in a boat. He had neither oars nor provisions, and was raving with delirium. He was carried back to New York and taken to Bellevue Hospital, where he was identified by the house physician as the man who had left there against orders 2 weeks before, scarcely recovered from brain fever. He had a lucid interval 3 days later, during which the nurse learned much of the foregoing. The man died that night, muttering of a palace of sin which was smitten by the hand of God. The Man Who Was Not Afraid. 4 young men sat around a table one winter's night in an old New England country house. Their host, Richard Churchill, was a civil engineer who had inherited some property, including this old estate, from an aunt, and he was giving a little winter stag party to 3 of his old college friends. On the table was a steaming punch bowl, and scattered about were pipes, tobacco, and cigars. The conversation touched lightly on various subjects: the struggle in the islands, the coming great presidential contest, and other current events. Captain Van Patten, a West Point graduate, who had done some things worthy of mention and won the bars on his shoulder straps at San Juan Hill, had just made a statement regarding the courage of a recent great naval commander. "You may talk about the courage that prompts men to do bold deeds in the bright sunshine, with hundreds of men cheering and fighting beside them, but the man who has the real courage is the one who, on a dark night like this, dares to walk by himself into a lonely graveyard and sit on a newly made grave." It was the host who had spoken, but as he had had the reputation at college of being afraid of the dark, there was a general laugh at his expense. "That," said one of the other young men, who was a doctor, and so accustomed to gruesome sights, "doesn't require much courage, and besides," he added, looking at the deep snowbanks outside, "one couldn't very well sit on a newly made grave tonight, for the ground is frozen solid, and there are snowdrifts 2 feet deep. However, There are several bodies in the vault over in the cemetery yonder, and I'm willing to wager that no one here dares walk over and knock 3 times on the iron door." "It seems to me," answered Captain Van Patten carelessly, "that you civilians have a very primitive idea of courage. If you will make a wager that would tempt a man to leave this most delicious punch and such delightful company, I will venture to go over and bring back a souvenir from your terrible tomb. Churchill, our host here, as nearest resident to the village graveyard, is no doubt supplied with the key to the tomb." He looked inquiringly at the young civil engineer, who nodded. "Well, as I remarked before, for a sufficient wager, I will agree to bring back to you one of the bats which probably haunt the place." The doctor, somewhat nettled at the bantering tone of the captain, rose as if to make what he was about to say more impressive, and said slowly, "In that tomb there was placed this afternoon the body of Andrew Phelps, who died in church last Sunday from heart failure. The clothes of the corpse included a black frock suit and a black silk tie. I know these things because the village undertaker was away, and I was called in to assist in preparing the body for burial. I will wager this gentleman, who seems not to be afraid," he added sarcastically, $100 that he does not dare, at 12 o'clock tonight, leave this courageous company, unlock the tomb, force open the coffin, and bring back to this room within the hour that same black neckcloth." "Taken," answered the captain promptly, and drawing a checkbook from his pocket, he wrote a check for the amount. "And now," he continued, "as I see the clock indicates 11:30, I shall have to request as quickly as possible the loan of a hammer and screwdriver." They brought him the necessary tools. He wrapped himself up in his great coat and left the house, whistling nonchalantly. "I didn't tell him which was the squire's coffin," said the doctor, after that Van Patten had left. "It might give even his iron nerves a shock if he opened the coffin in which they buried the remains of the tramp who was run over on the Central last week and was picked up in pieces in a basket, all except the head, which was never found." Van Patten trudged along through the snow towards the tomb. He wasn't a timid young man in any sense of the word, and the present excursion was nothing but a little adventure, which he could work up with frequent tellings into a good after-dinner story. "Rather a nasty night," he muttered to himself as he turned in at the cemetery gate. There was not a star in sight, and the sky was full of great threatening black clouds, which probably meant snow before evening. He unlocked the tomb and stepped inside, but it was some time before he could make out in the inky darkness where what he was seeking lay. There were 3 wooden boxes resting on iron bars set into the cement wall. All were of about the same length, and there was nothing by which to distinguish one from another, as he felt them over. "It is a wonder he wouldn't have told me that there was a party of them here. How's a man to know who's who?" said the captain to himself, and he gave a slight shiver. "Well, here goes for luck, anyway," and he began to unscrew the lid from the nearest coffin box. After about 10 minutes' work, he had the wooden cover off, and tried to pry the coffin open. The thing gave away at last, and he thrust his hand in and groped about the neck of the body, feeling for the tie. His hand met only a mass of lace and ribbons, and to his dismay he discovered that the corpse was that of a woman. He hurriedly replaced the cover, screwed on the lid again, and wiped the sweat from his brow. There was not a sound in the vault, save a thud now and then, when a piece of the ceiling, loosened by frost, fell to the floor or struck one of the wooden boxes. The humor of the situation was all gone now, and he was trembling as he began to work on the second box. Every few minutes his shaking hand slipped, and the screwdriver would jam against the box with a dully echoing thud. In his feverish haste he tried to turn the heavy screws with his bare fingers, but the rough edges cut him cruelly, and the box was soon splashed with blood. He did not feel the pain, however, and only worked the faster. He loosened, but did not wholly remove, the lid of the box, and then reached down to pry off the coffin cover, but he found that it was not fastened. He thrust his hand in and felt again for the throat, but to his horror there was no throat there. He passed his hand up higher and felt for the face, and there was only a little bunch of frozen flowers. "You're losing your head, Pat," he said to himself, but his voice was hollow and echoed strangely in that gruesome shut-in place. He reached further down and felt along the arm. He gave a little pull on the hand, and it came off at the wrist. Thoroughly unmanned, he threw the thing on the floor and ran shrieking from the tomb. Once outside again, the cold air brought him back to himself a little, but he could feel the touch of those icy fingers on his trembling hand. He was partly dazed and could not reason rightly. The long strain had been too much on him, but one thought remained uppermost in his mind. He must get that black silk neckcloth from the man whose coffin still remained unopened. He forced himself back into the tomb, but his heart fluttered strangely as he knelt beside the last box. He did not stop to remove the screws, but drove the hammer under the cover and twisted and wrenched the boards off furiously. The coffin lid withstood his efforts for some time, for the fastenings were strong, but at last they, too, gave way. He reached down for the throat again, dreading lest he should find some new horror. His hand touched a moist face, and the man in the coffin stirred and groaned. "Lie still, damn you!" he shrieked, and seized the man brutally by the throat. A hand, cold and clammy, clutched his feebly. "Let go!" he screamed with another curse, and struck the face angrily with his hand. He tore the neckcloth, collar and all, from the man's throat, and started to turn away, when a low voice came from the coffin. With a laugh that was not nice to hear, Van Patten staggered across the vault. As he neared the door, his head struck against one of the iron coffin supporters, and he fell heavily to the ground. Van Patten's 3 friends sat around the table in the country house, anxiously waiting for the return of the captain. The wager was lost to Van Patten, for it was nearly 2 hours since he left the house, and the men were about to start out in search of him, when the front door opened, and someone staggered into the lighted room from the hall. But the white-faced man who lurched toward them, with clothes torn and covered with blood, was not the captain, but Andrew Phelps. He talked wildly and incoherently, but they gathered from his ravings that he had been rescued from a living grave by someone who had immediately set upon him like a madman. Leaving the doctor with him, the other 2 men started out in search of the missing captain. They did not find him on the road leading to the cemetery, but when they neared the vault they found the door half opened, while the sound of maniacal singing came out through the night. They pushed the door wide open, and there, by the dim light of the lantern, a strange sight shocked their gaze. 2 of the coffins were broken open. One was empty, but partially in the other, and partially scattered about the tomb, as if thrown as a child tosses its playthings, were some ghastly things, the sight of which made young Churchill sick and faint. On the edge of the coffin in which the body of the tramp had been placed sat Van Patten, but he did not look up as they entered. They brought the light close to his face, but he only leered vacantly at them and continued singing. In one hand he held something on which he was trying to fit his fur glove, and at his feet lay a torn black neckcloth. The story the doctor told. To begin with, let me say that I am not a storyteller, neither can I make fine phrases nor coin strange words which shall delight the ear. I am only a country doctor, getting well along in years, and I write this tale only because I promised Richard Crewe to do, as I held his feverish hand while he lay and tossed in pain, and prayed for a death that would not come. So without further excuse or apology, let me begin. Richard Crewe was the only son of Sir Davies Crewe, distinguished as an artist, soldier, and scholar. His mother, Anne Sargent, was the fairest Englishwoman it has ever been my privilege to know. Of course, there was a plenty on both sides, so when the young lad Richard reached his 18th year, and under his father's careful teaching showed a decided taste for painting, he was sent forthwith to Paris, and placed under the best masters that gold could procure. As family physician to the Crews, I was somewhat of a privileged character at Redfern, as the old estate was called, and many an evening have I spent with old Sir Davies playing chess, or listening to his tales of a life full of strange experiences. It was I who helped young Richard to first blink his large blue eyes on this world, and who attended him through his trials of teething, measles, and all the other evils to which childhood is heir. It was my hand also which reverently closed the eyes of Lady Anne after a short illness, the very year that Richard went to Paris. Sir Davies never recovered from the shock of his wife's death, and what with brooding over her loss, shutting himself up in his room, and neglecting the exercise that a man of his physique always requires, I was deeply grieved but not surprised when Bingham, the head butler, came down to the house one evening to inform me that Sir Davies had died in an apoplectic fit during dinner. It is a bad thing for most boys who are about to come of age to fall heir to a lot of money, but when that boy is a student in the Latin Quarter of Paris, is fair to look upon, popular with his set, and generous to a fault, the result can be imagined. For the next 3 years I saw very little of Richard. He came to Redfern only occasionally in the summer, and then he was always accompanied by a gay crowd of his Paris associates, artists like himself, scribblers for some Paris sheet, and the hangers-on, invariably to be found in the train of the rich young man. These visits to his old home became rarer and rarer, for which the country people around were very glad, for they had developed into little better than riotous orgies, when nights, for weeks at a time, were spent in carousals, and the days in resting up only for another night. Exercising what I considered my right as an old friend of the family, I called one morning at Redfern to remonstrate with the boy, but I came away sorry that I had made the attempt. It was hard to imagine that the dissipated young wreck, with trembling hands and swollen, bloodshot eyes, was the same lad whom I saw the morning of his journey to Paris, as he whirled by on the coach and waved his cap to me in farewell. It was the same sad old story, wine, women, and song, and then more wine and more women, and for 7 long years the son of my dear old friend lived the life that is worse than death, and then came back to Redfern with the seal of sin upon his brow. Only once did I see him that summer after my morning call. Then I was called up at 2 in the morning by a young man in Austrian uniform, who, half drunk himself, begged me to, in a maudlin way, to come up to the house, for young Crewe was down with the jumps, as he called it. I went with him, of course, and found Richard in the old banquet room, with a motley crowd of men and women bending over him as he lay stretched out on the couch. I have seen many men in my life who have drunk too much, and are tasting that bitter after-draught by which an abused system avenges itself, and I looked to find a far different sight from that which met my eyes as they made room for me about the couch. In the white, drawn face before me there was nothing but fear, not ordinary healthy fear, such as every man at times experiences, but a kind of speechless horror, and his eyes, as they turned toward me, had in them the fathomless misery of a lost soul. His lips moved, and I heard him pleading faintly with somebody or something to go away and leave him for a little while. But as entreaties did no good, he tried to bribe the thing, and offered 1,000, 10,000 pounds to be left in peace. Then, as nothing seemed to avail, his voice rose to a frenzied scream, and he cursed the thing that haunted him, the God that made him, yes, and the mother who bore him. At last, worn out and exhausted, he sank back to the floor, and I succeeded in getting him into a fitful sleep, while that crowd of tawdry, painted women and drunken men crept past him out of the room, with all the laughter gone from their faces. The next day I was surprised by a visit from the young man, who, as might be expected of one in his position, was thoroughly frightened. I explained to him, as a man of medicine, just what his condition the night before meant, and he promised solemnly, and of his own accord, not to touch anything more for a year. Then he told me what he had seen the night before, for, strange to say, he remembered perfectly all he had been through. As he lay there, he said he could see across the room, slowly forming itself out of nothing, and yet having a frightful form, some hideous thing which, neither man nor beast, and yet resembling both, approached slowly, grinning at him. He could not describe it more definitely, for he had not learned to know it as he afterwards did. All that I could find out was that it was a great flabby creature that waddled as it walked, and though it had a face, it was not like anything he had ever seen. As regards this pledge to me, I think he kept it, for I heard indirectly from him several times during the year, and the report was always good. He was back again in Paris, but he had given up all his old companions, and was working faithfully. That year one of his pictures received a prize in the Salon, and he was prophesied a great future. I was away during the next year and a half, looking up interests of mine in America, and heard little that was going on among my own people. On the evening of my return to our village, therefore, I was surprised to see the big house at Redfern gaily illuminated, and was told by the servants that there had been bad doings up on the hill for many a day. The temptation of the old life had been too strong. He had gathered his all-too-willing crowd of former associates round him, and was celebrating with all the pent-up passion of a rule who has walked in the narrow path for nearly a year. He was sick with his old trouble twice that month, and both times, for old friendship's sake, I did what I could for him. But I saw there must come an end before many months. But such an end! I was surprised one day to hear the servants talking in the next room, for they said that all the crowd at Redfern had left for the city that morning, with the exception of Master Richard, who was shut up in his room working all day like mad on some picture, and drinking furiously at night. The end of it all came one night 2 weeks later, about 10 o'clock in the evening, when one of the maids came down to my house, white and trembling, to tell me that Master Richard was down with the horrors again, worse than ever, and would I please come up as quick as possible. I hurried on a hat and coat, and followed her up the hill. As we turned in at the little gate in the garden, I was startled by a shriek so terrible that I turned to the trembling maid questioningly. "That's the way he's been at it for an hour, sir," she whispered, and her teeth chattered as she spoke, though the night was not cold. She left me at the door of his room, and I went in alone. At first I could see nothing, for the light was turned down, but from the bed there came a low, moaning noise. Then, suddenly, the clothes were thrown aside, and, God help me, I saw a face the like of which I pray I may never see again. I have doctored many men in my time, and have seen some sights that are not nice to think about, but never have I seen such nameless horror, such uncontrollable fear, as looked at me from the eyes of that man. He stood there for a minute, gibbering and making strange noises like a beast, and then, jumping from the bed, he ran to a piece of canvas standing against the wall and covered by a thick drapery. He pulled the cover aside a little way and peeped fearfully behind. Then, in a very paroxysm of terror, he ran shrieking and screaming to the bed. He buried himself under the clothes, and I could hear him sobbing and moaning again as when I first came in. There is to me something inexpressibly pitiful in the sight of a man in tears, and yet I had to stay there for 3 mortal hours and watch that man. Always the same program, the look behind the drapery, and then that horrible fright, which in a few minutes was followed by another look. Toward 2 in the morning he quieted down suddenly, and I went and sat by the bedside, trying to soothe him to sleep, but he wanted to talk. "I am almost done for, doctor," he whispered, "but I have finished it, and it has finished me. I have lived a bad life, a very bad life, but on the canvas behind that drapery is the thing God sent me to avenge my wasted life. And when I am gone and you see what it is that I have lived with for the last 2 years, you will believe me when I say that I do not fear the terrors of any hell hereafter." He broke off suddenly and glanced fearfully about the room, but as if reassured by the pressure of my hand, he continued, "I lived straight for over a year after the pledge I made you, the night of my first trouble. I left all the old companions and worked hard. You saw the notice of my picture?" he asked eagerly, and I nodded. "During that year I met a woman who was the very type of all that is pure and innocent, and I even dared to think that sometime, after I had lived down my frightful past, I might make her my wife. But one day, as I was straining my eyes to catch the last light of the fading afternoon, I chanced to glance over the canvas, and my God, there, creeping out of the darkness, was that hideous thing. I was unconscious for several hours, but when I came to myself, I consulted the best physician in Paris, and was under his care for over a month. But it was no use. Since that day it has followed me everywhere, day and night. I tried to drown it in drink, and it only came the oftener. Then I sent the crowd home, and resolved to paint a likeness of the thing to have always with me, so as to accustom myself to it. But it was too awful." His voice trailed off into a shuddering whisper. I tried to turn his thoughts to pleasant things, and at last he began to talk of his childhood, and how he used to ride about the country in the little pony chaise with his mother, and the children of the village called him young Master Dick. Then, even as I watched him, I saw creeping into his face again that nameless horror. The pupils of his eyes grew larger and larger till you could scarcely see the blue. The sweat of fear started from his forehead in large drops, and in less time than it takes to tell, he was again a madman. He jumped to his feet and stood there for a minute, his knees knocking drunkenly together, and his teeth rattling like a pair of castanets, while his eyes stared straight ahead of him at the bare wall, and then he started for the picture again, but he never reached it. God in his mercy spared him the agony of that last look, and he fell forward, one hand clutching the drapery, which went down with him to the floor and left me staring at the thing it had covered. I looked, and something dragged me nearer, for painted on the canvas I saw an evil, formless thing which made my blood run cold. It might have been a man, for it stood upon 2 feet, and had arms and a head, and yet, thank God, it was no man. Or it might have been a devil, for if ever an imp of hell looked down from canvas, it must have had a face like that. Yet there were no definite outlines to it. When you tried to place a certain contour, it faded off into the somber background, and all that remained was the head, a great flabby thing without any nose, which looked down at you and grinned horribly. If that was the demon which had haunted Richard Crewe's fevered and disembodied brain for 2 long years, I thanked my God that I was not a drinking man. I looked again and could not turn my eyes away. Then, as I looked, I felt that indescribable, sickening fear coming over me that I had read in the dead man's eyes. The grinning thing seemed to be moving slowly. I could see the rocking motion of the body as it wobbled towards me. By a mighty effort of will, I tore myself from the spot, and seizing a French dueling sword that hung on the wall, I hacked and cut the leering face till only an empty frame remained, with a few clinging shreds of tattered canvas. Finis. And this concludes Welsh Rarebit Tales by Harl Oren Cummins. It was? Let me look back. Was the frontispiece supposed to be representing that last story? Yes. That looks pretty good. Not as horrible as it would in our minds. I'm not the first one to own this book, it would seem. I don't think I'll write my name in it. Oh, that was interesting. I think they definitely saved the best story for last. Yeah. Yeah, lots of those stories. Yeah, I could take them or leave them, but that last one, and there were one or two others I liked. Hey, Moosey Fate, welcome in if you're still here. And Squiddens, hello. Appreciate you guys dropping by. Yes, 3 miles from land. Please go check out Moosey Fate and Squiddens, you guys. That's good. I'm glad we finally finished the book, and now there'll be an audiobook version of it online for posterity. What year was this again? (1902). Wow, that's like almost exactly 100 years ago, give or take. Gosh. It's always interesting to read stories from so long ago and see what they have in them that's different. I didn't know that they had electric chairs that early. Which shows you know, how ignorant I am about the history of execution methods. Yeah, interesting stuff. And as I'd said before, I'm not going to start another audiobook for a while. I might do one late this year, but I feel like I've been, kind of streaming too much. And, if I do 3 normal streams a week and then an audiobook stream, that's 4 nights a week. That's a lot. And I mean, the question is whether I should still be doing 3 nights every week. And I'll continue to at least do that for the next couple months. Let's find somebody to raid. As what's coming up on stream, on Wednesday we're going to try and finish Goosebumps: Escape from Horrorland. On how many? Closer to the end of the month. Oh. I don't know. And I was thinking on Sunday we would do Morph Man, and then we would try and play one more FMV game this month, but and there's only the following Wednesday. But I think I'm going to put a poll up on Twitter that try and gauge people's interest in, should I try and play one more old FMV game or one more new FMV game? And if we don't finish it this month, hey, we'll finish it, I don't know, maybe in April. I gotta plan stuff out. But still, fun things in store. Let's see who's, still online. then mayhaps I should do a little more work. Oh, little percent. How Big D is streaming. Should probably. And wait, important research. We never get to raid them. And their streams are fun. They just like look at and discuss the most random things. It's really interesting. The underscore. So yeah, we'll go say hi to them. Hairball, welcome in. How are you? You guys, please go check out Hairball, the feline VTuber. We just finished reading Welsh Rarebit Tales, Hairball, finally, and we're just about to raid out. Detritus, the Demon's Quest. Oh yeah, that. Saw you playing some of that. That looked interesting. Did it have real photos? I wasn't familiar with that one. There we go. Busy? Ah, well, sorry to hear that, but hope it eases up a bit. Yeah, it's been busy for me too. Try not to think about that. But thank you guys for coming to hang out and listen to strange horror/weird fiction stories from over 100 years ago. Of course, Hairball. I appreciate all the chatters and all the lurkers. And you guys can find me on Twitter and MySpace, where I post stream announcements and random thoughts. You can find VODs of my past streams up on YouTube. And there's something else I was going to tell you guys, but heaven knows what it was. It'll come back to me in 10 minutes. So I hope that everybody has a good night, and may I suggest that if you find yourself hungry before bed, you do not eat Welsh Rarebit. Nah, stick with Welsh Rabbit instead. There's some poor substitute with cheese. But have a good night, pleasant nightmares, say hi to important research, and I'll see you guys for other nightmares on Wednesday. Goosebumps nightmares.